Hey, AP American Studies folks, we're looking at the Market Revolution PowerPoint Part 2. This one should be a little shorter than the first one. I had a lot more information to introduce to you in that one. This one, though, will be helpful for you in doing your, this one and the next one will be helpful for you for when you do your Shark Tank activity, which will be the same day that this material is due for you in class. So just make sure you've watched this before the Shark Tank. So remember on the previous PowerPoint, we talked about the 4 components of the market revolution, and the second component was the industrial revolution. You have to have new ideas and new stuff for people to want to buy, and you actually also have to have new ways of producing those goods so that they're cheaper. You can make more of a profit off of them, and that you can get these products to market and they're desirable by the people. So that's basic business sense here. So one of the things that I think is important here is, and I put this in bold letters, that bolded words, sorry. By 1850, for the first time, this is important, American industrial output exceeded agricultural output. Now, this is important because if you remember back to 1790, and we have this new Constitution, and George Washington is president, and he appoints to his cabinet Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury. Alexander Hamilton predicted this would happen. And that's why he put together his treasury plan the way that he did, is because he said that America is destined to not just be an agricultural nation, but an industrial one as well. Sorry. And one of the things that people like Thomas Jefferson thought was that this is probably not going to be good for the country to become more of an industrial nation. Thomas Jefferson wanted an agricultural nation. Of course, he's from the South, and Alexander Hamilton's from the North, and I'm sure that swayed their viewpoint somewhat. But Thomas Jefferson thought the best nation would be one in which you had independent farmers who own their own property, work for themselves, and were not having to work in a factory for someone else. And to be fair, it probably is a better life than a lot of those lower class factory workers had, and he was right about that. However, Alexander Hamilton was right in that we were headed for a more diverse economy. And by 1850, this is definitely true. We have more industry than we do agriculture in terms of output. So that's significant. Now, what's stimulating this economic growth during this time period from 1790 to 1860? A lot of things, and inventions are a big part of that. And I would say one of the key inventions that really kind of get the ball rolling, so to speak, is the concept of interchangeable parts. Because you can't have mass production unless you have parts that are standardized and can be changed from one product to the next. In other words, the same screw that you're putting in the side of a particular product would be the same one that would go into all of the products. And so therefore you can have consistency and you can have standardization, and this also makes it cheaper to manufacture. And Eli Whitney is the guy that introduced this idea of interchangeable parts. We don't have mass production without interchangeable parts. So his was with guns, is what he was first doing his with. Of course, Eli Whitney is also really famous. He had already become famous in the 1790s for the cotton gin, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, taking this concept of mass production to another level was Samuel Slater, and he's the father of the factory system, as sometimes he's referred to. He's the one that opens up our first textile mill in America in the 1790s in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And he brought to America, actually stole the plans from England, because they were already making these textiles for quite a few decades before they came to America. That would be the spinning jenny. So if you see to the right, it says see left, but that's wrong. See to the right. So the spinning jenny made it possible to not have to sit at a spinning wheel to create the threads that you would need to be putting into making cloth. This was huge because for the first time you could mass produce thread, which meant that then you could mass produce textiles. Okay, and while it was a pretty basic kind of a plant, it still set the standard. So what really caused the textile mill industry to take off in America is the question. Well, there's a lot of things going on. And one of the biggest is another product, and that would be Eli Whitney's cotton gin of 1793. And Whitney's cotton gin, 50 times faster, you could pick and seed cotton by hand. And as a result of that, you could have cotton be more profitable. And of course, cotton is used in textiles. And so the textile mills are using the cotton that's being produced in the South in their mill, and they're using the spinning jenny to weave it into thread. And as a result of that, we see lots of manufacturing in the North that is basically influenced by all of the cotton that's being grown in the South. So dramatic increase in cotton production, a lot more westward expansion. You can see on the map, people are moving into these areas, displacing Native Americans, by the way. That becomes a big issue in Jackson's administration. We'll talk about that in class. And southern cotton production here from 1820 to 1860, big difference, obviously. This became known as king cotton. Cotton was our major export by the 1850s, for sure. And it was pretty significant in terms of other countries purchasing this product more than some of our other products. Other textile related inventions. Okay, so you have up here the power loom that is being used in the Lowell mills, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And then also the sewing machine. And both of these are going to be important for, again, taking textiles out of the home and production out of the home into the actual factories. So clothing could be sewed in large-scale ready-made clothing factories with the sewing machine. Now, some people had their own sewing machines at home, but they were extremely expensive back then, so it was very difficult to own your own sewing machine, but factories could own them. Lowell system. In 1814, we have Francis Cabot Lowell, and he built the first multi-purpose textile mill in Waltham, Massachusetts. Now, by multi-purpose, you kind of can see here, it spun the fiber, so that's the spinning jenny idea, which he was using, of course, Samuel Slater's idea, and he wove the cloth into a finished cloth using a power loom, which you saw on the previous page, and then he printed and dyed the cloth as well in his factory. And this is, again, a huge shift from home weaving and textile manufacturing to factories, and this has some significant social impacts, which we'll talk about in the next PowerPoint. But the Lowell system, one of the things it's mostly known for, not just this, but the way that it's going to manufacture its products using particular types of labor. And he wanted to employ local farmers' daughters from New England. So these were daughters that were living at home. These were small farms. They didn't need all the help that perhaps they needed before. So a lot of these daughters were sort of shipped off to these factories to work. It was considered to be a respectable place to work, though, and so it wasn't considered to be a terrible place, at least initially anyways. They had dorms they lived in with some supervision, some activities. A lot of girls, of course, weren't going to college, so this became sort of a fun atmosphere for, say, like a 16 to about a 25-year-old is about the range that they were hiring. Once girls got married, they were fired, so they had to be single women. They replicated the system all over New England, and a lot of factories started to do this, but the Lowell systems kind of set the pace for this. What happens, though, is eventually a lot of these local farm girls are replaced by cheaper German and Irish immigrants. So they're coming in large numbers by the 1830s and 40s, and they're looking for work, and a lot of these girls had their wages cut drastically, and they had eventually went on strike to try to get higher wages or better working conditions, and for the most part they were shut down, and they were replaced. They were replaced by the immigrants, which tended to be sort of a trend in a lot of the factories when workers tried to speak out. There were working men's associations, and in this case it was working women that were trying to speak out, but it took a long time for that to happen. Communication revolution, this is huge. Samuel Morse with the telegraph, 1844, you can see it over there to your right. The first line was really short, actually, from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. That's not very long, not very far. But it did show that it worked, and it could provide instant communication over long distances. You have to have this ability to communicate from one section to the country to another in a fairly quick way in order for business to grow in a market revolution. You have to know Where are the raw materials? When are they going to be delivered? How much product are we going to sell to certain areas? People can put in orders for goods. You don't have that without the telegraph. It's extremely important. It's important too for when the railroads come in larger numbers in the 1840s and 50s, because they had to know where were the trains, were they coming in on time, was one train track down for whatever reason, maybe an accident or whatever. This helped to avoid accidents, and it also kept the trains running more efficiently. The biggest thing though is how it instantly linked the west to the east and the north to the south. And in the end, this was huge to the North's victory in the Civil War, because they cut the telegraph lines in the south, and a lot of the telegraph lines were actually more in the north than in the south. And so the ability to communicate was crucial in a war situation too. Another industry that really took off during this time period was the growth of the firearms industry. And firearms were a major manufactured product in America. It was something that was one of the first to really start to take off. It makes sense. People needed the guns to hunt, to protect themselves on the frontier. Eli Whitney had started with his interchangeable parts with a firearm, and then that got transferred to Samuel Colt, who introduced the revolver, which is this up here. You can see that it has a barrel with multiple rounds, so instead of just shooting it once with a musket where you had to like shove the gunpowder in the top part of the, basically the front of the weapon, you actually then just put basically your bullet in and you could fire. And then Remington introduced the rifle barrel, and with the rifle barrel you could shoot longer distances, and the firearms were more accurate, and as a result, of course, more deadly too. So a lot of times they're used against Native Americans, although sometimes Native Americans got a hold of the same weapons, and so that's why wars on the frontier became more deadly and used for hunting buffalo. That was huge, not just Native Americans, but also for whites. And of course, in all of these wars listed here, Mexican War, Civil War, and wars with Native Americans. I'm going to stop this particular PowerPoint, and we're going to move on to the last two parts of the Market Revolution ingredients.